Every year, surgeons around the world perform over 1.1 million rhinoplasties, nose jobs. It is one of the most requested cosmetic procedures on the planet. Celebrities get them. Athletes get them. Ordinary people save for years to afford them. Clinics in Beverly Hills, Seoul, and Dubai charge tens of thousands of dollars to reshape a nose. The plastic surgery industry is worth hundreds of billions globally, and rhinoplasty sits at the center of it. Here is what nobody tells you in those consultation rooms. The technique at the core of modern nose reconstruction was not invented in a modern hospital. It was not a 20th century breakthrough. It was not European or American. The foundational principle was documented 2,600 years ago in an ancient Indian medical text by a physician named Sushruta. And there is a specific, documented, fully verified moment in history when this ancient Indian technique was rediscovered through a man named Kawasji, a bullock cart driver in 18th century India, whose rebuilt nose changed medical history. That is documented history, published in the Gentleman's Magazine in London in 1794. And once you know that story, you start asking the obvious question. What else did India give the world that the world has not properly credited? The answer, as this video will show, is considerably more than most people know. In 1792, during the Third Anglo-Mysore War, a Maratha bullock cart driver named Kawasji, who worked for the British, was captured by Tipu Sultan's forces at Seringapatam in present-day Karnataka. As punishment, Tipu's army cut off his nose and one hand. They sent him back to the British, a deliberate humiliation. He lived without a nose for almost a year. Then things changed. A British official named Sir Charles Warre Millet, posted to the Peshwa court in Pune, noticed an oilcloth merchant with an unusual scar on his forehead. When he asked, the merchant explained that his nose had been cut off as punishment years earlier, and that a surgeon from the Kumhar community had rebuilt it entirely from a flap of skin taken from his forehead. The scar was all that remained. Sir Charles tracked down that surgeon. The technique his family practiced, called Nasika Sadhana, Sanskrit for nose reconstruction, had been passed secretly from father to son for generations. Nobody in Pune even knew when it had first been used. The surgeon operated on Kawasji and 4 other soldiers. The method, a wax plate shaped like a natural nose, was pressed against the forehead and its outline drawn on the skin. A flap of skin was then cut along that outline, but left attached at the base nearest the nose, so it stayed connected to its own blood supply. This connected base, called a pedicle, is the entire genius of the procedure. The flap was alive. It did not die. It was folded down, shaped into a nose, and sutured in place. Both wounds healed completely. The new nose looked natural. The forehead scar faded. 2 British physicians, Thomas Crusoe and James Finlay, watched the entire operation and documented it. Their account was published in the Madras Gazette in August 1794 and reprinted in the Gentleman's Magazine of London in October 1794. It caused a sensation in Europe, where surgeons had been trying and failing for centuries to rebuild noses. Their attempts using skin from the arm or thigh kept failing because the tissue died before it could bond. The Indian technique, keeping the flap alive through the pedicle, solved in one operation what Europe could not figure out in 300 years. A British surgeon named Joseph Carpuy spent years studying the 1794 report. In 1814, he performed the first successful rhinoplasties in England using what he explicitly named the Indian method. The technique spread across Europe. The forehead flap rhinoplasty is still performed in reconstructive surgery today. The Kumhar family of Pune, who preserved this knowledge in complete secrecy across generations, were never formally credited. Their name does not appear in Western plastic surgery textbooks. The technique used on Kawasji was not a new invention from Pune. Its roots go back to ancient Indian surgery, especially the Sushruta Samhita, where Sushruta described methods of nose reconstruction more than 2,000 years earlier. What the Kumhar surgeon near Pune did was preserve and practice that old Indian knowledge with remarkable skill, and Kawasji's operation made Europe finally notice it. The Sushruta Samhita is not a small collection of recipes or rituals. It is a comprehensive medical encyclopedia that covers surgery, anatomy, wounds, fractures, dislocations, surgical instruments, patient preparation, post-operative care, disease classification, herbal medicine, toxicology, obstetrics, and ophthalmology. The text describes over 300 surgical procedures, identifies more than 120 surgical instruments designed for specific purposes, and catalogs 1,100 diseases. It classifies wounds by type and origin. It describes the properties of hundreds of medicinal plants. It discusses principles of nutrition and digestion. It is, by any serious measure, one of the most advanced medical documents produced anywhere in the ancient world. What makes Sushruta particularly extraordinary is the surgical training system he describes. He understood something that every modern medical school agrees with. A surgeon cannot practice on a living person before training their hands. His students were required to practice cutting on soft plant material before they progressed to firmer material, then to leather, then to animal tissue, developing the muscle memory, precision, and control that surgery demands before they ever approached a human patient. The hand had to be educated before the patient could be trusted to it. This is the philosophy of surgical simulation, and Sushruta was describing it in the 6th century BC. Sushruta's description of rhinoplasty specifically describes taking a flap from the cheek, slightly different from the forehead flap used in Kawaji's case, and uses the same fundamental principle, keeping the flap connected to its blood supply by a pedicle while the new nose is formed and healed. The variations between the cheek flap and forehead flap suggest that the Indian surgical tradition continued to refine and develop the technique across the centuries between Sushruta and the Kumhar family of Pune. The procedure was not frozen, it evolved. 600 years before the Common Era, over 900 years before the first European medical school opened its doors, nearly 1,000 years before Galen, the physician Western medicine would take as its primary authority for centuries, had written a single word. That is when Sushruta, working in Varanasi, was already performing and documenting procedures that European surgeons would not attempt for another millennium or two. Sushruta also described cataract surgery, displacing the clouded lens of the eye to restore light entry, and procedures for urinary obstructions, abdominal surgery, wound closure, and the management of fractures. He documented specific instruments for specific purposes. The existence of specialized instruments is a clear marker of a mature medical system. A society does not design and produce specialized tools unless it is performing a procedure repeatedly and systematically, not just occasionally. When an English translation of the Sushruta Samhita was eventually produced, the copyright was not held by India, not by any Indian university, not by any Indian institution, not by anyone connected to the civilization that had created this knowledge over thousands of years. The copyright was held by a British organization called the Wellcome Trust. Think about what actually happened here. Indian doctors, healers, scholars on this very land spent thousands of years building a medical knowledge system. They tested it, they refined it, they documented it, they passed it down generation after generation. And then a British pharmaceutical businessman named Henry Wellcome sent a researcher to India with one job: extract everything useful from ancient Indian medicine. The contract was for 1 year. The researcher stayed for 11. For over a decade, shipments of Indian medical texts, plant preparations, ancient formulations, and medical knowledge left India and arrived in London. They were still arriving when the First World War ended. The company Henry Wellcome built went on to hold some of the largest medical patents in the world. Patents built on knowledge that originated in India thousands of years ago. The knowledge that Sushruta and generations of Indian physicians built on Indian soil became the foundation of a Western pharmaceutical empire. But this is only one part of the story, because not all of India's medical knowledge was written in texts that could be translated, extracted, and shipped to London. Some of it was hidden in plain sight, built into temples, encoded in stone, preserved in the daily rhythms of worship. Across the Indian subcontinent, from Afghanistan through Nepal to Bangladesh, there are approximately 3,000 temples dedicated to the goddess Sheetala Mata. Her name means the cooling one. In a disease defined by burning fever, the goddess associated with it is named after the relief from that fever. That is not coincidence. That is a civilization encoding medical understanding into the name of a deity. Now look at how she is depicted, and this is where it gets remarkable. She wears thin, minimal clothing, a reminder to dress a smallpox patient in light fabric because the disease brings burning fever. She carries a broom, a hygiene instruction. Keep the environment clean, reduce contamination. She holds a pot, representing either the cold water used to manage fever or the container in which variolous material was stored and preserved between vaccination sessions. She rides a donkey. In Ayurvedic literature, a skin element found on donkeys and horses signals the approach of smallpox season. The donkey is a seasonal calendar. Every single element of her iconography is a medical instruction dressed as devotion, visible to every villager who could not read a single word of a medical text. Sheetala Mata is one of the oldest goddesses in the Indian tradition, mentioned in ancient texts including the Skanda Purana. She is understood as both the source of the disease and its cure. She can bring smallpox and she can take it away. This dual nature is not primitive thinking. It is a sophisticated medical truth embedded in theology. The same material that causes smallpox, introduced in a controlled way, also protects against it. That is the precise principle behind every vaccine ever made. India built that understanding into the very nature of the goddess associated with the disease. Someone who understood this disease very deeply designed this system. The most compelling explanation is that Sheetala Mata represents the gradual deification of a real healing tradition. Practitioners whose knowledge of smallpox was so precise and so effective that the community elevated their work to the sacred. When knowledge saves lives across generations, it becomes divine. India did this instinctively, preserving what mattered most in the form most likely to survive. The word for vaccination in India today is tika. It was the same word used for this practice centuries ago. The practitioners were called tikadars. That word did not change because the practice never truly disappeared. In 1767, a British East India Company official named Dr. J.Z. Holwell presented a 40-page account of the Indian variolation system to the Royal College of Physicians in London, and was awarded a fellowship that same year. In his own words, he credited the Brahmins of Hindustan for a method generally followed with such marvelous success. He noted it was described in Ayurvedic texts over 3,000 years old. Brahmin practitioners from Varanasi, Vrindavan, and Allahabad traveled annually across the country before smallpox season, going house to house, giving dietary instructions, making controlled incisions, and running a silk thread infected with preserved smallpox material through them, inducing a mild protective form of the disease. They had such confidence in their dose control that they asked families how much pox they wanted. One Bengali practitioner told a European observer that his material had been preserved from his grandfather's or great-grandfather's time. Generations of carefully maintained, viable material. A supply chain Europe could not believe was real. The storage system was not simply preserving this season's material for next season. It was preserving a lineage of controlled infections across generations. The principle at the heart of this practice is what immunology now calls adaptive immunity. The ability of the human immune system to remember a pathogen it has encountered before and mount a faster, stronger response when it encounters it again. This is the core principle of every vaccine ever developed. Bengal was far better protected from smallpox than the rest of India, precisely because this practice ran at scale there. Research shows that at the start of the 19th century, 80% of India's population had no systematic protection against smallpox, except Bengal, where indigenous variolation had been operating for generations. Edward Jenner published his cowpox vaccine in 1796, 29 years after Holwell presented India's system to the Royal College. Jenner's contribution was real. Cowpox was safer than smallpox for inducing immunity, but the underlying principle, give the body a controlled, weak exposure so it builds protection before the real disease arrives, was not his discovery. India had understood it, systematized it, and run it at mass scale for centuries before Jenner. When the British introduced Jenner's vaccine in India, people resisted, not out of ignorance, but because they already had a working system they trusted. The colonial government banned Indian variolation in Bengal in 1804 to force the switch. Even that ban had limited effect. History gave Edward Jenner the title Father of Vaccination. The Tikadars of Varanasi, Vrindavan, and Allahabad, who were doing it generations before him, at scale, with documented success, received no such title. The only credit they got was a word. The word every Indian still uses today at a doctor's clinic. That word is tika. This matters not to diminish Jenner, but to accurately credit the intellectual lineage of one of medicine's most important ideas. India's contribution to the development of vaccination has been systematically underacknowledged. In school curricula, in medical histories, and in Wikipedia, which still classifies certain Indian vaccination practices under the heading of pseudoscience, despite the documented European accounts of their effectiveness. But here is what that suppression could never touch. You cannot classify a temple carving as pseudoscience. You cannot revise stone. In Tamil Nadu, there are temples where the stone carvings stop people mid-step. The Kongu Vaduganath Swami Temple is one such site. Carved into its ancient stone are images that show the stages of fetal development, the growth of a baby inside the womb, depicted in sequence, with an anatomical precision that makes modern observers stop and look again. This is not abstract religious art. These are detailed, sequential images of what happens inside a pregnant woman's body, carved by a civilization that clearly understood what it was depicting. And this was not an isolated instance of curiosity. Ancient Indian texts reflect the same understanding. The Garbha Upanishad, one of the ancient Upanishads, describes conception, the stages of fetal growth, and the development of the body inside the womb in careful sequential detail. A civilization that was writing about fetal development in its sacred texts and carving it into temple walls was a civilization that had looked deeply at the human body, not only when it was sick and needed healing, but at every stage of its existence, including the stages that no eye can observe from the outside. This is what makes India's medical tradition exceptional. It was not reactive. It did not wait for disease to arrive before paying attention to the body. From the surgical precision of Sushruta to the public health system encoded in Sheetala Mata's iconography to these extraordinary temple carvings, the same civilizational impulse runs through all of it. Understand the human body completely at every stage, from before birth to the moment of death, and preserve that understanding in every form available, in texts, in temples, in rituals, in stone, so that even if the books were burned and the practitioners were silenced, the knowledge would survive, carved in stone, waiting to be read again. If Sushruta represents the surgical genius of ancient India, then Karaka represents a different and equally important kind of medical brilliance, the understanding of the human being as an integrated system rather than a collection of separate parts. The Charaka Samhita is one of the foundational texts of Ayurveda, and what distinguishes it is the way it approaches health. The patient is not treated as a machine with a broken component. The person is treated as a living system in which food, sleep, seasonal change, mental state, digestion, daily habit, and environment all interact continuously. Illness in this framework is often not the arrival of an external enemy, but the accumulation of internal imbalance. This approach feels remarkably contemporary because modern medicine is slowly arriving at the same conclusions. Chronic disease, the dominant health challenge of the 21st century, is increasingly understood not as a simple mechanical failure, but as the result of lifestyle, nutrition, stress, sleep quality, and environmental conditions interacting over time. India built an entire medical system around these interactions thousands of years ago. Ayurveda's focus on daily routine, seasonal eating, digestive health, and mental balance was not superstition. It was an empirically developed framework for long-term health maintenance, built through generations of clinical observation in a culture where the physician treated the same families across multiple generations and therefore could observe, with extraordinary clarity, how the choices of one decade affected the health of the next. Ayurveda means the science of life, a name that signals the scope of the tradition. It does not mean only the science of disease or only the science of medicine. It includes the study of how a human being should live, what to eat in summer versus winter, how to manage transitions between seasons, what patterns of sleep support recovery, which herbs address which imbalances, and how the state of the mind affects the state of the body. Modern nutrition science, integrative medicine, and psychoneuroimmunology are all in various ways rediscovering ideas that Indian physicians were systematically applying thousands of years ago. The acknowledgement is slow, but it is coming. India's medical tradition built one of the world's most extensive and documented relationships with medicinal plants across thousands of years of use, observation, refinement, and transmission. Turmeric, neem, tulsi, amla, ashwagandha, brahmi, guduchi. These plants have been central to Indian homes and medical practice for centuries. Modern science is now studying several of them seriously. Some demonstrate significant anti-inflammatory properties. Some are being researched for their effects on stress hormones, immunity, digestion, and cognitive function. The fact that so many plants used in Indian traditional medicine have become subjects of active pharmaceutical research is not a coincidence. It reflects the fact that ancient India was engaged in genuine empirical inquiry about the natural world, observing, comparing, recording, and transmitting what worked. The Indian kitchen became, over generations, something genuinely remarkable, a domestic pharmaceutical tradition embedded in everyday life. Turmeric in warm milk for inflammation, ginger for the throat and digestion, ajwain for bloating, tulsi for respiratory infections, amla for immunity, fennel after meals to aid digestion. These were not random superstitions. They were accumulated clinical observations from a civilization that ate seasonal, local food and paid careful attention to how different preparations affected the body over time. Modern public health struggles to communicate the relationship between diet and long-term health because it feels abstract. India encoded that relationship into the daily rhythm of the kitchen for thousands of years, making preventive medicine inseparable from the act of cooking. This is one of the most significant and least credited medical contributions India has made to human civilization. The understanding that health is built daily in meals and habits and routines, long before the moment of crisis when a doctor is needed. That understanding is now the foundation of preventive medicine, lifestyle medicine, and much of what the modern wellness industry sells at considerable expense. India had made it a household practice thousands of years before anyone thought to charge for it. India's medical story did not end in the ancient world. The same civilization that produced Sushruta's surgical encyclopedia, that developed Ayurveda's comprehensive health framework, that practiced smallpox vaccination centuries before Jenner, and that encoded medical knowledge into the iconography of a goddess in the daily rhythms of the kitchen. That civilization continued to develop, survived 2 centuries of colonial extraction, and re-emerged in independent India as something new and globally consequential. Today, India is called the pharmacy of the world, and that phrase reflects a real and consequential global role. India is one of the world's largest producers of generic medicines, supplying affordable pharmaceuticals to patients across Africa, Asia, Latin America, and even developed Western markets. It is a major vaccine manufacturer, contributing substantially to international childhood immunization programs. When the price of a life-saving medicine falls in a developing country because generic competition has entered the market, India is frequently the reason. For hundreds of millions of people in low-income countries, an Indian-made medicine is the difference between treatment and no treatment. Not a statistic about export volumes, but a material fact about whether a disease is managed or whether a family is destroyed by it. India's vaccine manufacturing became globally visible during the COVID-19 pandemic, when the world suddenly understood how dependent it was on Indian production capacity. But the deeper story was not created by the pandemic and will not end with it. India has built pharmaceutical and biological manufacturing infrastructure that positions it as one of the small number of countries capable of supporting global health at scale. The ancient civilization that studied the body and developed systems to heal it is now one of the primary forces keeping those systems accessible to the people who need them most. But India's contribution to human health was never only physical. Long before the world had a word for mental health, India had already built a technology for the mind. And today it is the most widely practiced physical and mental discipline any civilization has ever given the world. The United Nations has formally recognized yoga as an ancient physical, mental, and spiritual practice originating in India, and the International Day of Yoga on June 21st is observed by hundreds of millions of people across every continent. The scale of yoga's global adoption is one of the most extraordinary examples of cultural transmission in modern history. But yoga's reach has grown faster than the world's understanding of why it works. Modern science has now established clearly that breathing patterns directly affect the autonomic nervous system, the part of the nervous system that governs stress response, heart rate, digestion, and immune function. Specific breathing techniques can lower cortisol levels, reduce markers of anxiety, improve focus, and support recovery from physical and mental stress. Controlled breathing is now being used clinically in the management of anxiety disorders, post-traumatic stress, chronic pain, and cardiovascular conditions. India's pranayama tradition developed these same techniques through direct observation and practice thousands of years ago, without the neurological vocabulary but with extraordinary precision about the effects. The Yoga Sutras of Patanjali, composed around the 2nd century BC, systematize yoga into a comprehensive framework with 8 branches covering ethics, physical practice, breath control, sensory withdrawal, concentration, and meditation. What Patanjali codified was not a fitness routine, but a complete technology of the human nervous system, a method for training the body's internal rhythms so that the practitioner could function effectively under conditions of extreme stress, maintain mental clarity when clarity was most difficult, and sustain physical health over decades rather than months. These are the capabilities that every high-performance human being in the modern world is searching for. India had a detailed methodology for developing them 2,200 years ago. The story of India's medical contributions is not a story about one genius or one discovery. It is the story of a civilization that placed the human body, health, and healing at the center of its intellectual and cultural life for thousands of years. And that developed, as a result, one of the most sophisticated and comprehensive approaches to medicine that any society in the ancient world produced. Sushruta was describing surgical techniques that Europe would not independently develop for 2,000 years. The Kumhar family of Pune was preserving, in complete secrecy, a nose reconstruction procedure that changed Western medicine the moment it was written down. The Brahmin practitioners of Bengal were running a systematic smallpox vaccination program decades before the man European history credits with the invention of vaccination had yet conducted his first experiment. Sheetala Mata's temples encoded medical knowledge into devotional practice and kept it accessible to every village on the subcontinent. The Indian kitchen distilled preventive medicine into the daily act of cooking. The yoga tradition built a comprehensive system for maintaining the health of the nervous system across a lifetime. None of this is adequately represented in the history of medicine as it is taught in most schools. The dominant narrative moves from ancient Greece to the Arab Golden Age to Renaissance Europe to modern hospitals, with India appearing occasionally as a curiosity. That is an error, and it matters because the history of medicine is also the history of what kind of civilization India was. That is one of the great medical civilizations in the history of the world. Thank you for watching this through to the end. It means a great deal. If you found this useful, share it. That is the best way to support the channel. Like, subscribe, and we will see you in the next video.